All right, I've got 1 o'clock on the dot. This is Michelle Carter again with AGRIP. And I know that normally we'd give a couple minutes, but I also know that this is a super hot topic that you all want to hear about. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on time. And I just want to welcome everyone. I know we have a selection of member pools, local government employees, QEI patrons, and partners. And as I said, this is definitely a hot topic because you are all attending AGRIP's first ever sold out webinar, which is pretty exciting for us. As most of you know, use of drones in the public sector is still quite exploratory. They're used by public entities, mostly in law enforcement and surveillance at the current moment in combating fires and public works activities such as inspecting utility lines. There's also emerging use of drones in the school environment for everything from recording sports practices and games to inspecting roofing and the top of floodlighting on football fields. Once drones are being used by any public entity department, it's reasonable to expect that they're going to continue to be utilized in more and more ways. In fact, by now it's likely that every pool has a member using drones, even if you don't realize it. So it's crucial that pools begin to think about the implications of this emerging technology. Some immediately identifiable risk areas related to drones are privacy issues, of course, possible property and liability issues associated with drone use where the drone could crash or damage someone else's property or person, and municipal airport liability for larger drones approved by the FAA and operating from a public airport facility. We know pools and their members are watching the commercial market response to drones for guidance, in particular as related to traditional aircraft exclusion language. But we also know that pools will approach risk with an eye toward finding ways to cover unique public entity exposures, including possibly drones. Our presenter today is going to help us through considerations related to this very unique question and update us on some aspects of drone regulation. We are pleased to have Carson Lyons join us today to present this webinar. Carson is Vice President and Global Product Line Manager for General Aviation at AOG Aerospace Insurance Services. He has a more extensive bio available on LinkedIn if anybody's interested in looking that up. And just one housekeeping item, a reminder to everyone on the webinar that you are automatically on mute during this presentation. If you have questions, you can type them in the comment box, send them to me. I'll either hold them to the end or interject during Carson's presentation if they're particularly relevant to the current slide. I know that he would welcome hearing your questions, so please don't hesitate to send them in. And with that, I will stop talking and let Carson get to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you may be. I hope this will be a pretty comprehensive yet fun and informative presentation for all of you on the phone, with the hope and expectation that you'll be able to speak to your colleagues and the public entities that you may be involved with a little bit more information in your back pocket on the exposures and the utilization of these aircraft, and maybe be able to use the information, or at least some of the information gained here, to posit some questions to yourselves in terms of how your current coverages or future coverages may need to develop to address these exposures in this new and exciting technology that's available. Just a quick run through of the table of contents and the agenda. I do think providing a short history on where these things came from and how we got to where we are today is worthwhile. Also, a brief description of what an unmanned aircraft system really is. I think there could be some implications both from a property insurance standpoint as well as a liability issue there that maybe all of you would have some interest in learning more about. Some of the commercial and public applications that we know of and are seeing already, and what will likely come in the near future, what the status of the utilization of these aircraft is here in the United States right now. Section 333 exemptions are what is applicable predominantly to commercial operations at this point, but I'll go through some quick slides on those to sort of address some of the issues that really do have some correlation or crossover to public entities that may choose to be operating the aircraft. What comes next, maybe a bit of a prognostication into the future in terms of regulation changes and what we should expect in terms of volume and exposures into the future. From an exposure and coverages standpoint, what exposures really are faced when operating unmanned aircraft at this point, and the coverages that are typically available from the aviation insurance industry at this point. Some underwriting considerations. What do I, as the underwriter, generally look for in a real general sense when we're looking at these exposures? Some concluding thoughts, and then hopefully we have a few minutes for addressing some of your questions should you have any. Just a short history, where we are today, how did we get to where we are? Really, unmanned aircraft have been around in some form or fashion since the dawn of man. Where I would really kind of key in on this is that radio control operations have been a very critical piece of the development of this. The first radio control flight took place in 1924, and the factoid, I guess, for this presentation would be in 1931. The British first started using the Queen Bee as a target aircraft in preparation for what was to come for World War II. And not so coincidentally, a male bee, if any of you know this, is called a drone. So that's sort of where the history of that term came from. During World War II, both the Axis and the Allied powers were very involved with trying to develop unmanned systems, so that did spur some significant development. Vietnam, all the way through the first Gulf War, really saw a lot of development with unmanned systems. Thousands of operations in Vietnam were flown with unmanned aircraft. And of course, the first Gulf War saw the development and the birth of the MQ-1 Predator from General Atomics, which is the most famous unmanned aircraft in the world at this point, for probably good and bad reasons at this point. After 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq, the development of the U.S. military on unmanned systems continued, as did other powers around the world. And then around 2004, the small UAS, small unmanned aircraft industry, really was born as the civilian world started adopting some of the more sophisticated technology on a limited basis. And this really came as the technology became cheaper, became smaller, became more adaptable to practical civilian uses. Then 2010 to 2013, this technology improved even more, and that leads us to where we are today, where we've got extremely low-cost, very capable systems that are available very readily to almost any individual or business for almost any purpose one might need them for. So what is an unmanned aircraft system? Just kind of want to give a brief description of some of the terms that you may have heard at this point. First, some of the relevant acronyms. Drone is probably the most common thing you hear in the media, newspapers, reports like that. You may also hear unmanned aircraft or unmanned unpiloted aircraft vehicle or remotely piloted vehicle. All of these terms from an exposure standpoint, from an aircraft standpoint, kind of mean or essentially mean the same thing. They are all unmanned aircraft systems or part of. So there's a lot of interchangeable terms depending on how you may hear that or have it referred to you in future conversations. A lot of commonality, basically all meaning the same thing. The components of an unmanned system, and this will be the only commercial in my presentation, we have a dedicated policy for this that is called the UAS 01 policy form. It's called the Unmanned Aircraft System Policy because it is actually a system that consists of the aircraft itself, the payload that would be carried, and this is really what the aircraft's flying for. This is the camera equipment, the sensors, the cargo, whatever it may have on board, why it's flying. The mission support equipment. Many of these aircraft have launch and recovery systems depending on their size, weight, and capabilities. The people that are involved with this are also part of the system. The pilot, the operator, the visual observer, the camera operator, the payload operator. All of those have, of course, an integral role in the operation and safe use of the aircraft. The data link, the communication between the ground systems and the aircraft to make sure the aircraft is performing as it should be, also an important component of the system. The space, that involves the airspace, air traffic control, weather, and the regulations that may be applicable to a given flight. And of course, the command and control component, which may be internal or external. The pictures you have at the bottom of the screen are examples of sort of an internal and external setup. The smaller picture on the left would be more of more typical of a very large unmanned system, very similar to the military Predator setup for the pilot of that aircraft. They're in a building removed from the airplane versus the exterior setup, which may be controlled by a small handheld controller, and then have a setup from a camera perspective or for the camera equipment that you can see there on the laptop, whereas live image and data collection can be logged right into the computer. Commercial and public applications, where we can expect to see UAS used. First, some understanding of why they're out there right now and why this has become so prevalent in the industry and in conversations we may be having with colleagues. The primary drivers. You'll hear possibly the 3 or 4 Ds, depending on how you're talking to, a why unmanned aircraft operations are so relevant and how they're useful at this point. First one is they're very good for dull flight operations, wildlife monitoring. Presently, you may have manned aircraft flying back and forth by state entities or government entities, going back and forth, counting fish, counting birds, looking to see where bears may be. Not very exciting piloting or flight operation experience, and that's one of those things that an unmanned aircraft can certainly be programmed to operate over a given area and collect the same information. Dirty operations, utility uses. There are operations where pilots have to work long, hard hours in an airplane in a hard environment, maybe spraying chemicals, maybe involved with just patrol of a long, desolate stretch of land. Certainly an issue where an unmanned system can do that in a similar manner, but not put the pilot in the position of being in an uncomfortable position. And that goes right into dangerous operations where the aircraft may actually be in a hostile area. There have been instances where, certainly one instance in Asia where there was an issue with a nuclear power plant where they were able to fly the unmanned aircraft through with radiation detection equipment to collect that data, which obviously would be not a good position or impossible for a human being to be involved with. And then the fourth D that sometimes is or is not included in the D's discussion is duration. Some of the missions may be beneficial to have the aircraft airborne for not just hours, but days or even weeks or even months. Obviously, humans have no way or no capacity physically to be able to stay awake or airborne for that amount of time. But some of the systems in development are certainly capable and should be able to achieve long missions such as that, where right now, even in the military, it's not uncommon for some unmanned systems to be flying for mission durations of 12, 16, 18 plus hours with a lot of regularity. But really the most important driver of why we're hearing so much of these things is economic. Plain and simple, these things are significantly less expensive to operate per hour than most manned aircraft systems would be. The best example would be a situation where a helicopter may be being used, where you've got a crew, including the pilot, maybe other equipment operators on board, and you've got an aircraft that may cost more than $1,000 an hour to fly, versus an unmanned system that may cost $100 or less an hour to operate from an expense standpoint. So that is really the driver. The economic benefits are substantial for so many industries. Public applications for UAS. First one off the bat, obviously, is public safety and law enforcement, the most obvious choice. Most of the aircraft presently being used that I'm aware of from a police or investigation kind of standpoint are actually not for spying on people or using search warrant kind of things to look in windows of buildings. They're actually being used very prevalently at this point in the few instances where they're being used for data collection after the fact, crime scene investigation and image collecting after an incident or crime had taken place, because they're able to take very, very good pictures, get very good definition in terms of location, and report that back to the operators, the police department, in a manner that would be obviously more expensive for a helicopter to do. Second is search and rescue. Imagine potentially the possibility of local police departments maybe in the future not having to be as reliant on the state highway patrol or the state police to fly, or a larger city to assist them with a manned helicopter to do a search and rescue for someone lost in the woods, like the little boy who walked away from his family at the park. Also, they're being used to provide imagery for fire suppression and arson investigations. And then finally, and this is something certainly that police and SWAT teams are very interested in, is the tactical advantage viewpoint and the live imaging during hostile situations, where the aircraft could be launched, could look around the corner, could look into a window of a building if necessary, and potentially save the lives and certainly improve the safety of the officers before they would be forced maybe to, in present situations, just storm the building. So certainly that advantage is very valuable. Other public applications, research and testing. There are a number of universities throughout the country that are already involved with using these aircraft for a wide variety of research purposes. There's discussion and use for weather monitoring, environmental monitoring as well, and I briefly touched on the wildlife surveys and research, wherein it's been said by some people I've met with, they've actually been able to fly these over herds of animals at night during the day, and from a few hundred feet, some of these aircraft are actually very quiet to the point where there's really no disruption to the animals in a way that a helicopter or a manned helicopter or airplane at this point would be quite disruptive to a herd. So again, just a number of benefits from a public use standpoint. What's available from a public and commercial application that we're already seeing a number of operators become involved with is infrastructure inspections, power line surveys and inspections, bridge and building inspections. Both have an element of danger tied to them. And if you've ever watched a video of how power line inspections and surveys can be done using manned helicopters, you can get an idea of the danger that is involved with actual people being that close to live wires and helicopters being that close to that type of exposure. But again, this will save time potentially and money by allowing the aircraft, the unmanned aircraft, to fly very near the building, the infrastructure, the bridge, very quickly determine where there may be somebody that ultimately may require a person to get close to, but not necessarily have to inspect the entirety of that piece of infrastructure by human means. Public and commercial UAS applications, again, continued. Film and television, a lot of public entities may be looking to do promotional videos, Chamber of Commerce type things, just take pictures for a website to promote travel and tourism, a number of different applications where at this point predominantly that would be largely handled by manned aircraft, helicopters in the position of the picture there in the middle. You can kind of see that helicopter down there in the valley filming the skiers. In the future, there will be certainly less need to have that type of exposure for both the aircraft and a physical damage to the aircraft, as well as liability to possible people on board the aircraft, by having unmanned systems be able to fly in that same type of area at a much lower cost with a lower physical damage loss if there is an accident, and a smaller footprint in the event of a crash. Separately, some of these aircraft are already being designed to have basically a leash on them where they would be able to follow the skiers down the hill automatically, or stay within a certain perimeter of a shot or a scene without much interaction between the human controllers on the ground. Disaster response and insurance, certainly something that we at AIG even are looking into ourselves, and certainly see some benefits in being able to respond very quickly to disasters, natural disasters, emergency scenarios wherein the aircraft can be used for search and rescue, or even from the standpoint of addressing and handling claims in a much more expeditious manner, in that the aircraft could be able to evaluate losses and exposures potentially far sooner than a human could get on the ground near a particular loss site. And then there's a number of other uses, aerial mapping, communication, gas exploration, inspections of different kinds, security, construction, traffic monitoring, a number of different exposures. And in fact, I would actually throw out there just to try to think of an industry where these aircraft could not be of some benefit in some way. And really, if you think of one, I'd love to know what that is, because there's even discussions of these being used for underwater and mining activities, even though they're aircraft, which I find very interesting as well. Commercial UAS applications, perhaps the biggest one, even though this isn't too relative to the public entity sector, is the precision agriculture piece of it. And I throw this up there just because it is expected globally that this could be up to 80% of the market for unmanned aircraft, because there is farming all over the world. And agriculture is also a very logical use of these systems, because it typically does involve rural locations away from populated areas, which of course lessens the exposure to the public on the ground, which the FAA is concerned about. And on this front, and you can relate this perhaps to some other industries, is the possibilities with the aircraft, because of the systems and capabilities they have to carry equipment and payload that can be used to do temperature sensory imagery, and use ultraviolet photography to determine things like where more water needs to go, or where the irrigation is good or bad, where there may be pest infections, where more treatment may need to be. They can be used for highly targeted spraying at in some locations. In Japan, these unmanned aircraft systems have been flying for about 20 years over rice crops and actually have been used with a lot of success there. Frost mitigation just by hovering or flying back and forth over the aircraft, the rotor wash could potentially have benefit. And even livestock monitoring, as I sort of mentioned with the wildlife research and work. Where is the herd? Even doing temperature sensory views to determine which cows may be pregnant and different things like that with a very quick overflight of a field. So a lot of amazing applications that can be used for these. I just throw this slide up there to kind of give you a perspective on what a typical octocopter looks like. This particular one, and also to give some size and scope of how big they are in relation to a normal person. This particular aircraft is mostly made of carbon fiber and plastic, and the wires you see there. It doesn't have all of the shell or the camera attached to it. As it is there in that picture, it's about a 7-pound aircraft. As you can see, a little over 3.5 feet wide. And with the camera equipment, the battery installed, the takeoff weight of this particular aircraft is about 15 pounds. And it can fly for 30 minutes to an hour depending on weather conditions and that type of thing. Just throw this up there just to give some size and scope of what a lot of these aircraft do look like. What's the status in the U.S. today? Public and private operators, their primary course of getting approval to operate is through what's called a Certificate of Waiver or Authorization, or a COA or a COA. You may hear that one of those different ways. What it does is it provides an opportunity for public operators to gain specific approval for the use of unmanned aircraft from the FAA. It does require an application to the FAA and a comprehensive overview of the operations and the aircraft that would be involved. Typically, when these are approved, they involve approval for a very specific use in a specific location, and frequently will have some limitations involved with the approval. At this point, there really hasn't been any broad use of blanket approvals, meaning you just have approval to operate this anywhere you want, any time you want, for any purpose you want. Hundreds of these have been issued at this point, though a large percentage of them are military related. And private commercial entities or private individuals may also seek these, along with gaining an airworthiness certificate, but these have been very limited in number at this point. Commercial operations today, again, not too applicable to the public entities, but it's worth, I think, having some background on where the regulations are and the status of this, because it is in the news with some frequency. The most famous case dealing with these is Huerta versus Perker. Basically, several years ago, this gentleman, Rafael Perker, flew an unmanned aircraft over the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And in October of 2011, the FAA fined him $10,000 for operating in a careless and reckless manner so as to endanger life or property of another. There's plenty of video available on the internet to watch this, where you can judge for yourself if that in fact was the case. But in any event, in October of 13, Perker appealed to the NTSB. I'm not a lawyer or real familiar with how the FAA and NTSB kind of work together from a legal standpoint in a court scenario, but the appeal was made to the NTSB, and then in March of last year, a judge actually granted a motion to dismiss the FAA order that assessed the original fine, basically saying, I don't see where the rules are that prohibited him from flying the aircraft as he did. Immediately, the FAA appealed to the NTSB, and then right before Thanksgiving and just a few months ago, the NTSB reversed the March judicial decision, affirming that unmanned aircraft are aircraft and that the FAA could impose the $10,000 civil penalty. So that kind of puts us in a position where if unmanned aircraft are in fact aircraft, the FARs then would be applicable, and there really is no more gray area in terms of how they can be operated, who should be operating, that type of thing. What's left at this point from a commercial standpoint is that Perker possibly could appeal in some way, shape, or form again, but we'll see how that plays out in the future, I suppose. So the 333 exemptions are the option for commercial operators at this point, predominantly to gain approval to operate unmanned aircraft today. This was designed as part of the 2012 FAA Modernization Reform Act that Congress, as part of that act, mandated that the FAA integrate small UAS into the airspace by September of this year. 333 refers to the section of that Modernization Act that allows the FAA the flexibility to allow some commercial entities to fly before final UAS rules are in place. And really, commercial operators are able to use that section to petition the FAA for exemptions to existing federal aviation regulations in order to gain approval to operate by basically proposing alternative methods of compliance that would still have an equivalent level of safety to those operators that are able to comply with all FARs. For now, this really is the process. Several companies have already had their exemption requests approved, while the FAA has received, actually at this point, as of right now, it's over 200 exemption requests have gone through to the government as of this month to get approval to operate in the future. 333 exemptions, what are some of the common attributes of operators that have already been approved or have received their approval? I throw this up to just kind of illustrate is that part of the COA process when they're evaluating the operations, the FAA, look for some similar kind of information in terms of the aircraft and how it's operating, who's operating it, those types of things. So some of the things that the FAA appears to be looking for from a 333 approval standpoint is that the aircraft is generally small, less than 55 pounds, including any of the attached equipment, the cameras or the batteries. They're also generally looking at the aircraft not being excessively fast. Most of them that they've approved thus far operate at speeds less than 50 knots, although there have been a couple exceptions that I'm aware of to that. Generally, they're looking for the aircraft to stay below 400 feet above the ground. They're looking for aircraft to be operated within a visual line of sight of the pilot or the operator at all times, and that's to be unaided by any corrective, other than they're allowed to wear regular glasses, but they're not supposed to be using any supplemental visual devices to see the aircraft. They're also looking that a visual observer be involved who's able to communicate verbally with the PIC at all times. There is a value to having somebody else looking at the aircraft because having flown some simulators and having some exposure to these systems, it's very easy to get fixated on the aircraft, and you may lose a little bit of that peripheral vision that can provide that safety buffer. And the visual observer could be in a position to say, hey, you're getting close to that building or that tree or those people or whatever the case may be. Continuing with some of the aircraft and pilot requirements, they're looking for, at this point, generally speaking, that the operator must follow the manufacturer's maintenance, overhaul, and replacement inspection of equipment that may be part of the aircraft. This is a big sticking point for a lot of the industry. So far, the FAA, for the commercial operators, has required that any operator of an unmanned aircraft for commercial purposes have a private pilot certificate or better, which is beyond the means of most of the operators that are seeking to fly at this point, and certainly is a contentious issue for a number of them. And they also want to see pilots of the unmanned aircraft maintain a minimum level of experience and proficiency level, just as they would for pilots of manned aircraft in a very similar manner, that they have currency, that they have frequency, that they've had a certain number of takeoffs and landings within a given amount of time. And they also want to make sure that the pilot and visual observers have completed a qualification process by the operator themselves. As far as public safety is concerned, so far they're generally looking to see that the aircraft aren't operated directly over people, except those that are consenting and involved with the use of the aircraft, so that nobody's really in the way in the event of a UAS failure or an emergency situation. Regarding distance from non-participating persons, meaning those people that have nothing to do with the operation, the general public, they've generally been looking for, and again, on the commercial side, that these aircraft not fly within 500 feet of people unless they're directly involved with the work. But there's been an example where they've allowed that buffer to go down to 200 feet in the case that it didn't adversely affect safety because there was a large building essentially in between. The case was made that there could be a large building between where the aircraft was flying and another sidewalk, for example, on the other side of the building that provided an increased level of safety for occupants on that parallel street. As far as other emergency procedures and minimum fuel, they want to make sure that the aircraft has the capability to return to a predetermined location and lands or is recovered in some other means in accordance with the operator's manual in the event that the communication between the ground station and the operator and the aircraft fails. They also want to make sure that the UAS aborts its flight and has a procedure for that in the event of it meeting any unpredicted obstacles or emergencies. Finally, as far as this is concerned, as far as manned aircraft goes, there are minimum fuel requirements. Obviously, this doesn't apply to a lot of these since they're battery powered, but in a lot of scenarios, they've looked to have the flights completed within 15 or 30 minutes from takeoff to the conclusion, or that they return to land with at least 25% battery power remaining, whichever occurs first, just to ensure that there's enough juice to make it back to where a safe landing area may be. As far as notifications are concerned, again on the public side, but have some applicability to the, again on the commercial side, but having some applicability to the public side, is that the aircraft makes some notification to the local flight standard district's office that basically says where the aircraft's going to be, how it's going to be used, when it's going to be flying, so that manned aircraft are in the position to be aware of aircraft or unmanned aircraft that may be in the vicinity of a given location. And interestingly, taking the position that these are aircraft, if there's an incident, accident, or flight operation transgression outside what had been approved, it's supposed to be reported to the FAA, and just like if a manned aircraft had an accident, they are supposed to be reported to the NTSB. As far as some other general things are concerned with the approval piece of this, the aircraft are supposed to remain clear and yield right-of-way to manned aircraft at all times. Unmanned aircraft system operations are supposed to be predominantly conducted only during the day and under visual meteorological conditions. And that aircraft aren't supposed to operate in Class B, C, or D airspace, and this is generally the airspace that's located around control tower airports or larger cities without written approval from the FAA. They basically want to make sure there's not a lot of conflict between manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft, and that by keeping aircraft more than 5 miles away from the airports, that they can certainly lessen some of that exposure. What comes next as far as commercial and public operations are concerned now through next year? The congressionally mandated target that I mentioned earlier in the year, that September of 2015 rule, by all accounts in the industry, that's not going to be met. So at this point, we're really waiting for the FAA's notice of proposed rulemaking, the NPR of the draft rules to be released. We've been waiting on this now for a few months. Once that comes out, there will be a public comment period, and because the comments are expected to be quite extensive from so many different industries and so many people looking to operate these aircraft right now, the expectation is that this may be late 2016, even into 2017, before a final rule becomes part of the federal aviation regulations in terms of direct correlation to unmanned aircraft systems or small unmanned aircraft systems. I throw interim directive up there just from the standpoint that because this is such a hot button issue and there are congressmen involved and senators involved and people in this industry involved in complaining to different public entities and public officials that something needs to be done there, the possibility exists that the FAA could come out with some kind of exemption process that's faster, simpler, easier, or different from what maybe we're expecting, but we just don't know. Exposures and coverages. So why the need for the insurance? Why are you on the call today? The piece of this that I would throw out there is relating to the coverages that you may have in place already or that you may be thinking of putting in place. As I go through some of the exposures, I'd maybe just have it in the back of your head to be thinking about how you might be covered today, how you might need to change things in the future or modify some of the coverages that you're looking at or that you have in place to address some of these exposures and concerns, because they are quite real, and there is certainly exposures that was mentioned at the beginning of the call. From a liability standpoint, again, we're coming from an aviation perspective from my background, looking at these as aircraft. The fact of the matter is aircraft do have accidents from time to time. Nobody intends for them, but they do occur. And when the aircraft do have accidents, when there is an aircraft crash, frequently there is bodily injury and property damage tied to such a loss. Certainly, while these aircraft may be smaller, may not weigh as much, if they fall, if they lose engine power, they lose battery power, and they have an accident, certainly there's the possibility for serious injuries to be taken to occur on the ground by the public, and certainly property damage could occur when it hits a car or a building, somebody's property, and causes some damage just from the impact. Consequential losses are certainly realistic. If it was a large enough aircraft and knocked out power to a building, and there was different stuff in the building that maybe required that power to be supplied at a constant level, things could go on in that direction. But one thing that a lot of people don't think about is the catastrophic loss potential. Again, because the aircraft are so small that they're not thinking in this perspective. Many of these aircraft are very capable machines. The technology is very good and very capable, but they are capable of reaching altitudes of several thousand feet in many cases. And there are manned aircraft carrying hundreds of people in that airspace potentially. A mid-air collision with between a manned and unmanned aircraft certainly could be a very catastrophic loss scenario to the point of causing significant ground and in-flight losses. And you could have simpler accidents that may be even more realistic. The aircraft crashes on a highway during rush hour and causes a significant accident with fatalities or something along that lines, or something along those lines. So there is really very real exposure in the event of an accident with the aircraft on those fronts. Another thing is non-owned use of unmanned aircraft. You may, or one of the entities or several of the entities that you're involved with, may not choose to buy and operate the aircraft themselves, but they may hire unmanned aircraft owners and operators to perform a certain task for them. If they have an accident with the aircraft while being hired by one of your partners or member entities, there certainly could be some of those same exposures brought on you. And then within the aviation insurance industry, personal injury is one of the key things, and certainly something I think is of interest to all of you, because that is what does address the privacy exposure that these aircraft do involve. One of them is obviously the unreasonable searches and surveillance. I can kind of follow this up with most states so far. I believe we're in the 30s or even up to 40 states at this point either have passed some type of legislation or are looking at it at a state level in terms of how police are to be able to use these aircraft, whether they need or don't need a search warrant and those types of issues. So from that standpoint, it would be beneficial to be aware of the individual state laws related to the use of these aircraft. Trespassing, you don't really think of that with aircraft, but with unmanned aircraft and their size and their capabilities, I could certainly get one of these in the backyard of a home. I could fly over my neighbor's property. I could fly and look in their kitchen windows, which leads to an invasion of privacy. Obviously, there is an expectation of having some seclusion in my home in certain circumstances. They could also take pictures or put on a website or a publication, a newspaper, the private facts. The easiest example of that is somebody's out with somebody maybe that wasn't their spouse, and the other spouse sees that, and that could potentially lead to a lawsuit of some kind. You can actually stalk potentially and harass people with an unmanned system, following them, showing up repeatedly where they don't want to be seen, a number of different issues with these. And then business privacy. Hey, what's that company next door? What's that town the next just over there? What are they doing for this event or this exposure? Maybe we can fly our UAV to kind of look in on there and get some ideas. A number of different issues there. The bottom line with respect to the privacy issue is the FAA is really kind of taken the position that they are not involved with the privacy aspect of this, more of the operational side, and that state, local, federal laws relative to privacy are really going to be the driving force behind what's allowed, what's not allowed, and what there would be some need to be aware of as an operator going forward. This coverage certainly can be considered, but just some general best practices that have already sort of come out on this front is that the operator, the entity that's using the system, should have policies and procedures relative to the operation and use of the aircraft, as well as how they're dealing with the collection, storage, use, and destruction of any of the data that is collected by the aircraft. That in combination with having good pre-flight risk mitigation procedures, such as not flying over private property perhaps without permission of the owner, and little things like that, can all play into mitigating or at least reducing some of the privacy exposure that certainly comes with operation of these aircraft. Physical damage exposures, I mentioned this briefly earlier in the presentation, but one of them is obviously to the aircraft itself. If you have pool members or entities that certainly invest or acquire some of this equipment, many of these aircraft are very cheap from an acquisition standpoint, just several $100s or a couple $1,000s, but many of them are significantly expensive, and frequently the payload, the camera equipment, the data collection equipment that they may be carrying is worth even more than the aircraft itself. You throw in the ground control equipment, whether that be a handheld or ground control station that communicates with the aircraft during flight, and any spare part equipment that may be used for any of those components, and you may have a significant investment by one of the entities for that property exposure that is different than the buildings or other property that may be maintained or owned by a given entity, because this property goes up in the sky. So there is some different exposures with a lot of that. Physical damage coverage is another consideration that may be out there. Generally speaking, in the aviation insurance market, just as an FYI, normal deductibles on that physical damage stuff at this point seem to be in the 5 to 10% range, but they certainly can vary and typically would be going higher than lower in a lot of cases on those. War exposures, this is also a little bit different from what would be traditional with manned aircraft systems, because they can face a lot of different exposures that maybe wouldn't be applicable if you have individuals or pilots in the cockpit. The aircraft have the potential to be maliciously attacked. There was an example where an individual shot down his neighbor's drone because he didn't like it being flown near his house. They can actually be hijacked through a number of different means, one of which would be called spoofing, which is basically sending false GPS signals to the aircraft, making it think it's somewhere else other than where it actually is, and they could be sabotaged. You could have somebody do something to it while it's on the ground or stored, and that could cause the aircraft to do something unplanned while in flight. So as I mentioned before, it's a very different potential exposure than what we're used to from an underwriting perspective, but it can be considered from a coverage standpoint, but typically on a case-by-case basis. So what are some of the underwriting considerations? What would I ask for typically? This is just a really basic slide in terms of things that are normal questions from an aviation or aircraft operational risk, but it really comes down to the type of aircraft that's being flown, the specific make and model. We're developing more and more information on individual models on a daily basis, monthly basis going forward as we see more and more of this business. The operator experience, how familiar are they with the equipment? How experienced are they in flying? Do they have any aviation background? Do they know airspace? Do they know any regulations? How is the aircraft being used? Where are they using it? Those all kind of play into the key foundations of the risk evaluation for an aviation exposure. Now there will be several additional questions or sub-questions to each of those components, but that kind of gives you an idea of where the core of the questioning may come from a risk evaluation standpoint. Values and limits that are required. Does the aircraft require physical damage coverage? How much is it worth? Does the payload or ground equipment require physical damage? What limits of liability do you want to have? Do you have some operational procedures and risk mitigation items in place that lessen the exposure, lessen the risk, or at least convey a good handle on prudent operations for the aircraft? And then finally, training. Do the operators, do the people involved directly with the aircraft have any training, have any experience with respect to something that may be provided by the manufacturer of the aircraft itself, or have they attended any number of different schools or training programs that have already been established for the use of these aircraft? And then finally, some conclusions. the future really is now. As we move forward, we're going to be looking at some significant growth over the next 2 years and probably see a significant jump once there are formal regulations in place late 2016, 2017, and beyond. As I said before, that's the kind of the time frame when formal regulations really will be in place, and that's going to have a likelihood, in all likelihood, a big impact on the industry. The FAA has estimated at this point that about 8,000 commercial UAVs could be flying within the next 5 years or so, and public entities could mean even thousands more. One stat I kind of heard, and I don't know how accurate the number is, but there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 or 50,000 individual law enforcement agencies in the United States right now, and about 300 of them have aviation wings at this point, and mostly that's, again, state highway patrols, state police, larger city government or city police departments that are operating their own helicopters or fixed-wing aircraft. That's a lot of entities that don't have an aviation exposure right now that maybe will, thousands more in the future, if there's the possibility perhaps someday of a small town being able to launch an unmanned system from the trunk of a patrol car, for example. So the potential in terms of volume is pretty significant going forward. This is really unprecedented exposure, and it does sort of require new insurance and requires us to think about some things that maybe we hadn't thought about before. Truly new exposures don't happen all that often. And when I relate this to aviation, the best example I can think of is that prior to UAVs, the last really truly new thing we had to deal with was helicopters in the late 40s and early 50s. But there aren't a lot of underwriters around still who were working on that at that transition time that are still with us today. So we're really in a position of having to deal with the challenge and move forward and create a market and a product that is viable and beneficial to an industry that is really ready to go and burgeoning. So there's a new challenge with that. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. Okay. But what's fun about this, I think we get the opportunity to rise to the occasion, and collectively we get to assist in the development of what really is a completely new industry within aviation that can provide so many benefits to us as the general public. And that's a pretty exciting place to be, I think, from an insurance standpoint. The final message, hey, these things are around. They're going to be here well into the future, and they will be a part of our lives. The industry is here for good. The potential applications for this technology are almost limitless, and changing regulations and guidelines are going to be a certainty for some time. At this point, unapproved operations are pretty extensive in terms of how the FAA would view them. Final rules are still probably a year or two away at best. Laws specifically with respect to privacy issues are going to need to be addressed. The best example there is thinking about the internet and cell phone technology, where the technology has been ahead of regulation and law. This is going to be very similar to that, where law and the guidelines with respect to privacy and things like that are going to need to adapt as well to the new technology. But the bottom line, I think, for this is both as people in risk management and insurance, as well as just being in the public, as there's a great opportunity here from a work standpoint and from an individual standpoint, just as being a member of the public in terms of all the benefits, increased safety, reduced costs that the aircraft can be part of their operation in future to benefit us all. So with that, I kind of conclude the presentation. If, Michelle, there's any questions you received, I'd be happy to use the remainder of our time for that.
Carson, thank you so much for taking the time. That was a really great presentation, and we do have a handful of questions here. And I suspect that your answer to a lot of them will be what your conclusion was, which is, yes, it's an issue, but we don't really know how much yet because we're entering this exciting new territory together. But we have two questions on the liability exposure. And I believe you addressed them, but since we've got two similar questions, I thought that I would raise them. One is the liability exposure for local government agencies that may be associated with hobbyists or businesses operating drones. What is the agency's liability? And then also, as you touched on, what is a pool's liability for a catastrophic event. For the question asker specifically asked if a drone were to fly into some power lines and cause a brownout or blackout, what kind of liability would there be for that?
It could depend on a number of things. I know there's different government immunity statutes and certain jurisdictions and places, so that could certainly be a factor in this. But the reality of it is, and the way I would generally state this is again relating this to the manned aircraft industry. If a government entity hires or uses or owns and operates an aircraft and it does have an accident, there is the likelihood of lawsuits. There is the likelihood of claims being made should there be any bodily injury or property damage on the ground. And it's foreseeable and I think generally pretty realistic to think that even though the unmanned aircraft is quite a bit smaller and wouldn't necessarily create the same damage, that the reality is if there's injuries, it probably won't be a whole lot different in terms of what to expect in the event of that loss. And that's where the insurance comes into play, from being able to provide the defense, being able to provide a settlement if in fact there's some kind of judgment being made for a covered loss, and that's really what we're here for.
All right, thank you. We have a couple other questions here that all kind of relate to either underwriting guidelines or policy endorsements. I'll do the policy endorsements together. We've got two separate questions on it. Wondering if crime coverage is available as a policy endorsement. And then the other related question is, given that the drones capture and transmit data electronically, do you see any possible tie-in with cyber liability coverage?
The answer to those questions probably is possibly and maybe, I think. And this is part of the interesting piece of this exposure, I think, in that I've been a firm proponent of dialogue and communication with the operators, the industry, the brokers, the pool managers, the industry, the underwriters that may be involved. Different companies may view this a slightly different way. But the reality of it is, yes, the data transmission, the crime exposures, they are there, but from an industry standpoint, we haven't had to deal with it maybe the same way as this exposure now brings to us. So I think there's a lot of evolution that will need to occur and development that will need to occur on an ongoing basis that will address some of the needs. So the answer is maybe it's available for some exposures with some carriers at some points for some risks, but I think the possibility and the capability is there is that the coverages for individual risks, individual operators, will come to fruition as the need, the demand, and the understanding of what the exposures are by the understanding of the underwriters and those involved with the exposures grow more aware of the need for the coverage and what the exposures may be. So a lot of the development I think will take place is that we can have a policy out there or endorsements out there today that may work, but probably will be able to be better as the industry develops and as we get more and more feedback as an industry to adapt and evolve the products.
Great, thank you. We've got an kind of interesting question here on reinsurance, which is, are you aware of what kind of stance, if any, reinsurers are currently taking about providing liability coverage for drones?
I can't speak too directly to individual companies or our specific setup in terms of our reinsurance, but I will say that the reinsurance market that I have familiarity with that deals with the aviation markets around the world, they're very aware of the exposure. They have legitimate underwriting concerns and questions to the direct underwriters or the primary underwriters such as myself. But there is, I think, an appetite to get involved with it, recognizing this is a growth environment and a growth opportunity for the industry. But really an understanding that we need to develop it. We need to make sure we're making prudent underwriting decisions as we move the product and capabilities of the coverage and variety of coverage we just need to be prudent with those decisions as we're moving forward, and take some methodical approaches, but yet have a kind of a visionary approach to some of it at the same time, in terms of developing things that aren't available today, but clearly there's a market for.
All right. Then we've got a couple questions relating to calculating coverage. Specifically, the question asker said, in aviation coverage, typically the hull rate is based upon $100 increments of stated value. Is there a similar underwriting guideline to determine hull value for drones? And then also kind of related is, do you have an estimate of the premium per drone, and what kind of limits? That, that question's probably kind of broad, and I don't expect you to know exact, but it came in, so I'm going to ask it.
Well, I can give I think a pretty generic but good answer to that question. As far as underwriting determining a hull rate, yes, in aviation we do have, if the aircraft value is between this number and this number, or at this value, then a hull rate's calculated based or developed from that value. So very similarly with respect to unmanned aircraft, that is the case. That is the way it's being developed at this point. I think there's probably, because of the newness of the technology and the limited historical data, that the rating's probably a little bit higher than would be expected for a manned aircraft at this point. As far as moving on to the liability limits that are out there, most operators that we see submission activity from, they're looking at pretty low limits, $1 million, $2 million, even some that are only seeking $500,000. That said, I've seen requests for $250 million, $500 million, basically looking to match whatever limits that they keep on whatever that entity has on their primary coverages along other lines. Individual companies are going to have their individual appetite towards those risks and those limits, but the capabilities potentially are out there to get higher limits and more developed coverage. But it's just going to be based on, again, some of the individual parameters of that risk. Where is it flying? How's it being used? What's the experience of the operator? Those things I mentioned will all come into play in terms of, A, is coverage available at all, and B, how much of it is available, and then C, if it's available, how much is it going to cost? Generally speaking, I mean, premiums, they're all over the map, but depending on all those different factors. A lot of them see premiums in the very, the real high three figures, low four-figure numbers for liability-only type coverages, into the tens of thousands of dollars based on higher limits, higher hull values, physical damage coverage being added. So again, it's really kind of case-by-case based in terms of what coverage is being sought, what limits are out there, what the exposure is. But I think a lot of those premiums tend to be lower because the limits being requested by most operators are lower. And seeing those, kind of lower four-figure numbers, and then up from there.
All right, we've got a few more questions here, if you don't mind bearing with us. These two are kind of related, and I believe you touched on them a little bit, but how reliable are the drones? Do they crash often? And when they do crash, do they have any mechanism to tell if it was due to drone malfunction versus something like a high wind or something like that?
Depends on the system, quite frankly. There's some that are very capable, some that provide a lot of telemetry data back to the ground station, so that even if the aircraft is severely damaged to the point where there's nothing really recoverable, some of that data may actually be able to be captured and reviewed and analyzed. Some of the systems don't have any of that. There's a very broad spectrum there. How reliable are they? Some are more reliable than others. I don't want to pick on any manufacturer or anything in a forum like this, but the easiest example is there's plenty of accidents. There's plenty of stories of these wrecking. There are plenty of videos on the internet of drone crashes and UAV accidents. That said, the majority of operators, just like with manned aircraft, don't run into those problems. And another piece of it is that a lot of the accidents that have occurred were from operators that don't at this point buy or purchase any insurance, so we don't have really any data on those incidents, just the ones obviously there were coverage for. So there's some more to be learned there, but a lot of it really depends on the type of aircraft, the actual system that's being used in terms of its capabilities, its use, what it may be able to transmit to the ground, and how adequate the operations are from an accident standpoint.
Okay. We've got another question here, kind of related to policies again, and I guess I'll just throw it out there that it was asked and kind of as a consideration, because I think we've touched on pretty well that the policies very much depend on the usage and a variety of other factors that we don't know everything about yet. But the other comment or consideration that came out will drone policies call for annual operator training similar to recurrent simular training for pilots? I don't know if you want to comment further on that, or if you just want to say, we'll find out together.
I would say it's the answer again is going to be, and I hate giving cheap answers, but I think the answer is it depends. Different markets are going to look at this differently. Different aircraft will require ultimately different decisions be made on them. But as the product evolves, as the industry evolves, I think it will develop into a position where if you're operating a certain aircraft for a certain type of thing, that will become more the industry norm and the industry expectation. And then if you're operating a different aircraft for a different purpose, that a different expectation may become the norm. There's so much yet to develop with this. Training is available right now. It will continue to be available. It will probably evolve just as the insurance product does. And different companies will make their own underwriting decisions as far as those requirements go, I think.
Okay, great. We've got 2 more questions related to the FAA, and then that's it. So the 2 questions about the FAA are, does their waiver relate to educational agencies that are using drones in their curriculum? And then the other question is, do their restrictions prohibit drone use in urban areas?
They generally, I mean, again, they're going to look at all of the operations in a silo from the standpoint of how they've approved these things thus far. If the aircraft is to be flown by an entity, they're supposed to develop or get the approval through a COA, depending or regardless of whether it's for research or student, program development. Generally speaking, they've not liked these operations to be in real urban areas, but again, there's a number of different operations and capabilities you may be able to present to the FAA to get approval for them. If they're flown indoors, if they're flown in a netted area, if the risk is mitigated such that the FAA can say, hey, the exposure here is minimalized and the safety of people on the ground is relatively good in the vicinity of these aircraft operations. It's their decision. They may approve it. They may come back with comments and say no way. There's a bunch of different options, but the key thing I think to realize is that by having guidelines and establishing something to promote the safest environment possible for the general public is sort of one of those steps that the FAA is looking for to make a determination as to whether approval can be granted or not. But it is all case-by-case basis at this point.
All right. So we had one last question related to the FAA that just came in. Just to clarify, do public entities watching wildlife need an approved application from the FAA to operate? And based on your answer, I would say that's a case-by-case basis, right?
Well, it's a case-by-case basis. The FAA has been pretty clear, I think, at this point of saying if you are flying the aircraft for a non-hobby, non-recreational purpose, that you are supposed to get approval from them to operate the aircraft. So in that instance, the answer is probably you should still be getting approval, but that's not my position to make that decision. But if it's not for recreation or hobby use, the FAA has generally held pretty firm to that their requirement that their approval is required.
All right. Excellent. That is the end of our questions. If we didn't get to everyone's, I apologize, but I wanted to let you all know that we will be having a session on drone usage at our upcoming conference. the Governance and Leadership Conference, March 8th to 11th in Las Vegas. So if your question didn't get answered or you want to learn more on this topic, I encourage you to join us then. And this webinar will also be available on AGRIP's website if anybody wants to revisit or share it with a colleague who didn't get to attend. And Carson, thank you so much for taking some time this afternoon to be with us
Thank you.
on this subject. And thank you everyone for attending.